All right. Ready?
Yeah, I am ready.
Yeah, okay. The world is changing at a rate that we've never seen before. From business to art to sports, these changes are affecting every aspect of our lives. My name is Nick Castner, and we're setting out to talk with the people who are altering the way things are done. Along with Alec McChesney, this is the Commonwealth. Our guest today is Ralph Castner. Ralph served as the chief financial officer for both Cabela's and Bass Pro, two of the biggest names in outdoor retail. When Ralph joined Cabela's in 2000, the company had 5 stores. Over his 18-year tenure, Cabela's grew to 80 locations across North America. Ralph led Cabela's through its initial public offering on the New York Stock Exchange in 2004 and chartered a credit card for the retailer that grew to the 14th largest in the country. In 2017, Cabela's was sold to Bass Pro for $5 billion. Ralph oversaw the wire transfer and was the only Cabela's executive that remained in the acquisition. He is also my dad, so thank you for joining me.
Yeah, how you doing, Nick? Why is it taking us so long to do this?
Yeah, that was my first question was when I asked you, you seemed surprised. So when I started this little podcast thing, did you ever think that you'd be a guest?
Oh, I don't know if I thought about it or not. I mean, it's probably taken me a while. It's probably taken me a while, quite frankly, to just kind of separate myself from the Cabela story and probably be able to talk about it. So, okay. I guess I thought I could have put it this way. There were a lot of other Cabela's people that probably would have been a better choice than me to have had this conversation. But we'll talk a little bit about that because I was involved. Cabela's existed as a company for basically 50 years, I believe. No, actually a little longer than that, 55 years. And I was around for about the last 20, rounding up. And those first 35 years are when a lot of the real, entrepreneur stuff happened. I'll talk some about that a little bit. But a lot of those people that were involved in that, quite frankly, are very introverted. Dick Cabela is no longer with us. He passed away several years ago. So I'll be happy to talk about it and talk about what kind of what happened before I got there and what happened while I was there.
Okay, so to start with, how did you join the company?
Well, at the time, I was at First Data Corporation in Omaha, which I'm sure most of your listeners are familiar with. It was a large credit card issuer. They'd talked to me about doing some other things. Your mom and I, Nick, had decided we wanted to stay in Nebraska. Cabela's was always a super interesting company. And a little bit ironically, my father was from Sydney, which is where Cabela's is headquartered. So that probably helped in some small way get through the moving to rural Nebraska. Okay. We moved out there in 2000. I think at the time you were 3, or maybe 4. And we went out there. Turned out to be a great decision. We loved living in Sydney. Great place to raise the kids and a great company, and I wouldn't have traded the experience for anything. Yeah,
so Cabela's was headquartered in a small town right on the Nebraska-Colorado border. There was about 7,000 people in the hometown. There were 90 people in my high school class. Yeah. So you just found the job like online? Oh.
Actually responded to an ad in the paper.
Okay, that's funny.
And there was a few other at least 2 other common traits. A guy named Mike Hupp, who is one of the lead partner of Coley Jessen, was doing the work for them. And I've known Mike for years and actually grew up in Norfolk next to your mother. And Jerry Madsky was on the board of Cabela's, who was a good friend of my father's when he lived in Sydney. And I'm sure those guys provided introductions that were really helpful. So it wasn't just like a random resume showed up on their desk.
Yeah. How was the transition to small town America?
There were a couple of things that were, I guess, funny to me when we moved out to Sydney that I quickly got over in the first couple of months. But one of them that sticks out is I remember one time on a Saturday morning pulling up in front of the local grocery store and it was closed. I wasn't sure I'd ever been to a closed grocery store before. So there were things like that you kind of had to learn to work around. But the benefits far outweighed it. The relatively short commute, the fact that you do things over lunch, the fact that a lot of kids' sporting events what you could do after work, which left your weekends free, those were all huge advantages to living in a small town.
Mm-hmm. And what was the company like when you got there?
That's actually a great question. I assumed you'd ask me that. I want to spend a little bit of time on this because it was pretty interesting when I arrived. So I started in 2000. So the company was, 38 years old at the time. And they did. I mean, they were a force largely through catalog, which seems kind of, this will seem kind of foreign to some of your listeners today, but they had a huge catalog business where they did, I don't know, 900 or $1 billion worth of sales. So it wasn't insignificant. They were not terribly profitable, but they had a great brand. I mean, when I showed up in 2000, which was amazing, and you instantly got it, is the management team was there, how close they were to their customers, and understanding what their customer wanted, quite frankly, because they were the customer. And they knew what their customers wanted better than anybody, and had built a pretty formidable catalog business based around keeping track, taking care of your customers, putting great products, and building an unbelievable brand. It was, I don't want to say it was unprofitable, but it was profitable, but there were opportunities to improve on the profitability. So that was kind of the first thing you found. And quite frankly, historically, they'd hired great outdoorsmen and great hunters, and that built the brand. And they were just starting to bring in people with other, I guess I'll say more sophisticated, for lack of a better word, but more formal business training to help sort of transition the company forward. And I was one of the earlier people on that phase of growth.
Yeah.
So
was the catalog business, was it mainly in the Midwest, or was it?
No, it was nationwide. And that was one thing that was really hard that I'm sure most people didn't appreciate. But I always described the Cabela's customer as living between Omaha and Boston, on that sort of line there. But Michigan, Pennsylvania, those were great states. A relatively small portion of it was in Nebraska. Now, the two things that started as I was getting there that were a big deal, we were just starting on retail expansion. And I think we'd opened a bunch of stores in late 99 and early 2000. I think there were 6 stores when I was there, but that was a relatively new phenomenon. And the other thing that was new, and I'll be happy to talk about this as long as you want to, but they had issued a co-branded credit card, and it was partnered with National Bank of Commerce in Lincoln. And the way there'll be a lot of people that listen to this that can speak to this, but the way that deal was originally set up, it was a joint venture between National Bank of Commerce in Lincoln and Cabela's, where they agreed to put the receivables into a 50-50 joint venture.
So what's a receivable?
I'm sorry, receivable is the amount charged on the credit cards.
Okay.
So the assets of the credit card program were put in a 50-50 joint venture. And at the end of the deal, the story was relayed to me. There's other people who give a slightly different story of this. But the head of National Bank of Commerce said, I'll do this crazy structure. But looking at Dick Cabela, said, if you and your brother ever sell Cabela's, I want to buy you out at book value. And Dick Cabela, in his brilliance, said, that's fine, but if your family ever sells the bank, I want to buy you out of book value. To which, of course, the people that own the bank said, this bank's been in our family for 100 years. We're never going to sell the bank. And the week I showed up, the bank was sold to Wells Fargo. So that triggered our option to buy out their half of the credit card business, which is why we chartered our own credit card business that we got chartered in 2001. So the three forces that were going on about when I started that were pretty game changing was the ownership of the credit card receivables, retail expansion, and then one I didn't mention is the internet. The internet was just getting off the ground then. And those three forces fundamentally changed the company. By the time we left in 2000, what you would call the traditional catalog business, which is where you mail somebody a catalog and they call you up on the phone and place your order.
Yeah.
That was a very, very small piece of the total. Now, we still mailed a lot of catalogs, but those orders, we always viewed that as a way to prod people to get online. Mm-hmm. But so we still had a heavily catalog mailing, but the very few of the orders were taken by phone.
Yeah. You mentioned one of your first projects was starting that bank. How common was it for retailers to own a bank at that time?
At the time, it was more common. Target I'd have to think through who they all were. Target had one at the time, or maybe they chartered there shortly after we did. Nordstrom's had one at the time. There were a handful of retailers, but really the Federal Reserve didn't like it because they thought there was an inherent conflict of interest with retailers owning banks. And then what really messed it up was Walmart applied for a bank.
Okay.
which got all the independent bankers excited that Walmart was going to threaten their business. And after that, and that happened, I would guess in 2004, 2005, the Fed pretty much stopped granting charters for retailers to own banks.
Okay, but you still own yours, so they couldn't take it away.
No, they could not take ours away, but some would argue they made it as difficult as possible for us to own one.
Okay. And how do you go about writing a charter for a bank?
Oh, there's an application process you go through.
Yeah.
It's not.
And that was your job, right?
Yeah, that's what I did about the first year I was there. We wrote an app. You had to get fingerprinted. You had to tell what the bank did. You had to do financial projections. You had to talk about how you were going to get funded. There's kind of a funny, for some of your listeners, there's kind of a funny Nebraska story there. On the night we had it all orchestrated so that we would get our charter on a certain day, and the bank kind of sprung to life, which meant we got our charter, we bought the receivables from NBC, we closed on all of our financing transactions, and I think a week before that day, we got a phone call from the Federal Reserve that said there was a problem. So I said, look, the guy that called me, I said, look, and I remember his name. I won't tell it to embarrass him, but I said, look, do you even know who Cabela's is? And we talked for a while, and finally the guy said, Ralph, I'm from Ogallala.
Wow. Which is about 45-minute drive from Sydney.
45-minute drive from Sydney. And he said, I'll take care of this. And sure enough, about 3 days later, it was cleared. It was cleared, and we got our charter on time. It was extraordinarily helpful.
Mm-hmm. You earlier mentioned being in the first batch of employees with like former business training in quotation marks. Did you hunt and fish at all when you joined the company?
No, I really didn't hunt and fish at all. And that was an interesting learning experience for me. Of course, these guys were all hardcore hunter and fishermen.
Yeah, of course.
And I never, I loved going. I loved learning about it. As I tell a lot of people today, I feel about hunting and fishing about like I do skiing, which is I love the eating and drinking part of it. The doing part of it's fun too, but it's clearly the social aspect that's a lot of fun.
Mm-hmm. What role did Jim and Dick Cabela have at the stage?
That's interesting. Jim, it was very, very different. Dick was always the face of the company and spent a lot of time traveling and outdoor-related things, but he wasn't in the office much. You did see him at board meetings. You saw him in the office periodically. Jim, conversely, Jim Cabela was sort of the protector of the brand. And he was in the office every day, but rarely gave any specific advice unless you went to go ask him. So, for example, when we were chartering the bank, and I remember this vividly, which was a pretty complicated transaction for us at the time. The only thing Jim voted on was the name of the bank.
Okay.
And the working name we had was called, I think it was called Cabela's National Bank. And Jim vetoed that because he did not want to make collection calls as Cabela's.
Okay.
And we changed the name to we were the world's foremost outfitter, so we called it World's Foremost Bank. And that was Jim's input in the whole deal. So it was just interesting. Jim was really the protector of the brand, and anything that he felt diminished the brand, he would veto, regardless of the financial consequences. Mm-hmm. For example, he wouldn't let beer ads in the catalog. Okay. There was just things you couldn't do with the brand, and he was the protector of that.
Interesting. And so this bank that you've talked extensively about, did it operate like a traditional bank?
Well, I'll say yes. I mean, it was limited in that our only assets were credit card loans, and our only deposits were brokered deposits of more than $100,000. So we didn't have branches, we didn't have checking accounts, but we went out and got deposits. They were just really, really big deposits and securitized things. So it was much more limited in nature. You didn't drive by a world's foremost bank branch.
Okay. And then how did the credit card work at first? What was the...
Well, it was a typical rewards-based card, and that was actually invented by, there's some guys, I mean, I probably get more credit for the actual credit card business than the actual concept of the credit card was actually devised by guys named Dave Rohr, Tom Boatman, and that was more done in the late 90s, but it was a rewards-based card where you got 1% back on anything you charged outside of Cabela's and up to 5% in the store, and you earn free stuff to redeem at Cabela's. And I can remember Dennis Hybe saying, kind of jokingly, Ralph, the only reason this works is so guys can earn free stuff at Cabela's and not have to tell their wives about it.
Yeah.
And there's probably some truth to that. I mean,
Yeah.
it was a way for avid hunters to earn free stuff at Cabela's, and we loved it because people spent more money when they perceived it to be free in their mind.
Mm-hmm. Was it difficult integrating the card into the operations of the store?
No, and it took a while to get buy-in from everybody in the organization, but that was actually one of the challenges we probably had in the Bass Pro merger. We really had everybody in the organization thinking about club. And club's what we call the credit card business.
Mm-hmm.
And anytime there was a touch point with the customer, we always said, how does that impact the club? And there's 100 examples, some of which might seem silly, but when you add them all up, they're a big deal. For example, when we sold wallets, the guy whose job it was to buy the wallet said, we're going to put a Cabela's club in the wallet. So when you flip it open, there'll be a sample Cabela's card to just reinforce that's what we need to do. It's just ideas like that became a really big deal. The first thing that really, to give you an example, and this was done before I got there, but one of the things that really kickstarted the program, and this was initiated by, I think Dave Rohr, but I'm not. He clearly was one of the leaders behind it. When you could remember back then, we were taking almost all of our orders on the phone.
Mm-hmm.
And when a phone call came in to place a credit card order, we pre-screened you as the call was coming in. So if you called in and say, we'd identify you as Nick Castner, we could pre-screen you for a credit card and determine if you qualified for one. Then by the time the call was over, we'd say, gee, Mr. Castner, you've qualified for free Cabela's card. Would you just like us to put this order on your card today? And the acceptance rate of that was enormous.
Yeah.
And that really kick-started the program. And then once we got more retail stores, the retail stores were a big originator of cards.
Yeah. How did you get that focus across teams and departments?
It was really just a lot of hard work, but really telling the story about how the club can help the merchant or help the store. We had to make sure that everybody knew how helpful it was to them in selling product. We actually had a board member, Reuben Mark, who was one of the he was the former CEO of Colgate-Palmolive,
which is the toothpaste company.
The toothpaste company. Yeah. And he just made a big point, drilled in our head. The main job of the club is to sell merchandise, not the other way around.
Okay.
And that's the way we viewed it across the organization. I think that perspective of buy-in really helped integrate it. And at the end, I can remember Mike McCarthy was one of our board members. I remember he always pointed out how well integrated it was. And quite frankly, it's probably something I took for granted until post-Bass Pro merger and just saw how they really didn't think about the club and in some ways kind of made fun of us for how much we did.
Yeah. At the earlier mentioned about the same time that there was a shift on expanding stores. How did you decide where to build a new store?
Well, I suppose if you're going to simplify that question, simplify the answer, it was really, we just went where our catalog customers told us to go.
Okay.
We had all this, we knew where all of our catalog customers were. And I'm way oversimplifying this, but it's a pretty good example. At the time, we assumed that only about 1 out of 10 people was willing to buy stuff without first trying it on, touching it, and those kinds of things. So we assumed that wherever there was a catalog customer, there were 9 other customers who were willing to do business with us, but just hadn't because they weren't comfortable ordering through mail order. Mm-hmm. And that proved to be pretty true. So some of our first stores were in Minnesota, Michigan, Pennsylvania, places where there were a lot of hunters, South Dakota. Those were some of the first markets we went to.
Yeah. And then the internet taking off about this time, was there an importance on shifting to web orders right away, or how did that evolve?
Well, I would tell you in the 2000 time frame, it was probably more if you build it, they will come. I mean, we tried to build a really good online presence. I think a lot of what happened is it was just catalog people switching to the internet because it was easier. Now, I mean, it was an easier way to do business. Yeah. Now, as we morph through time, probably, and I say, I have to put this in perspective, probably early 2010s, we started to think of ourselves as way more of a digital company.
Yeah.
And, using Facebook and YouTube and some of those things. But, for the first 5-ish years of the internet, we just built a website and took orders. And I'm sure some people stumbled across this without first getting a catalog, but a lot of it was catalog people choosing to go online or searching.
Interesting. So in 2004, Cabela's went public on the New York Stock Exchange. Why? Why?
Well, I wasn't in on the decision specifically to go public. I think at the time, Dick and Jim Cabela were very different people. Dick had 9 children. Mm-hmm. Jim didn't get married for the first time until he was 70, which was well after the 2004 IPO. They had very different liquidity needs. It was an opportunity, and there were other shareholders other than Dick and Jim that also wanted some liquidity. So it was a good opportunity for shareholders to get liquidity, and those that didn't want liquidity could stay part of the new public company.
Yeah. Who had share owners before then? Yeah, so what was it early employees who had?
A lot of it was early employees. There were really 4, in the pre-public days, there were really 4 big shareholder, maybe 5 constituencies. There was Dick and Jim Cabela, J.P. Morgan Chase, their private equity arm, was an owner, and then Mike McCarthy here in Omaha represented another ownership group. And then the 5th one would be employees. Dick and Jim Cabela were extremely generous with employees, and there were a lot of employees that were shareholders of the company.
Mm-hmm. And why the New York Stock Exchange? Just because it's
just because of the prestige. We thought about the NASDAQ, but we had really that was probably J.P. Morgan's and maybe McCarthy's input, and then I even remember arguing about what the ticker symbol would be, and we had to try to get CAB, which was CAB, and that was even. That even took a little bit of work because I think somebody else had it.
Okay. And then do you buy it from someone? Or?
No, somehow I think the New York Stock, it was used, but by somebody that didn't use it very much. It was like somebody's preferred stock or something. I don't know if they got them to switch, but somehow the New York Stock Exchange showed up and just said, yeah, we got it for you. Yeah.
How do you, what's the process of taking your company public?
Well, it was a long. Yeah, I'll try to get it in 5 or 10 minutes. But it took us from the day we decided we were going to go and got the nod. It was in December of 2003, and we went public in June of 2004. So you spend the first 6 months working on the public documents, which are just reams of paper describing the company, describing the financials, describing any intercompany, any related party relationships there were. And that took, 3 or 4 months at times of what was mind-numbing experience. Mm-hmm. And then basically what happens towards the end when it really gets going is you spend about 3 weeks on the road meeting with investors in an exhausting process to drum up support. Matter of fact, it was, I don't know how much of this you remember. You weren't very old at the time. But we flew to Europe first.
Okay.
And our board wouldn't tell you this at the time, but you go to Europe because if you screw up, nobody will know it.
Okay.
Because word won't get back here. So they kind of wanted to test us to see how we do. So I think we spent 3 days in Europe.
Where at in Europe?
I think just the UK.
Okay.
I'd have to think about that.
I remember Grandma and Grandpa watching us for extended periods of time.
I think it was just in the UK. And then we came back and spent 2.5 weeks in the US flying around the country, talking to investors. Then when you're done with that, you end up in New York, and they have a day that you sit in a meeting and say, okay, we can sell. And we actually didn't sell that much stock. The company was worth about $1.2 billion at the time, and we sold, I think, $108 million of shares. So we only sold about 10% of the company.
Okay.
But they say you can, at what turned out to be, I think it was $22 a share. At $22 shares, we can get the full $100 million cleared. And you all sit around the table and you agree you're going to do it. And the next day, we went and rang the bell at the New York Stock Exchange, and we were a public company.
So that 10%, do you find the current owners that do want to liquidate, and that's where the equity comes from?
It can. I think in that it can. We'd been advised ahead of time to not do it that way because there's always a negative impression if existing owners are trying to sell.
Okay.
So in that case, it was new shares of the company.
Okay.
And then over time, any owner that wanted to sell could sell their shares.
Okay.
Because you're now in a public market to do so.
Yeah. What was it like flying from Sydney to this relatively small company in this very small town in America was flying around the world and dealing with the New York Stock Exchange and kind of all of a sudden playing in the big leagues.
Well, there was always I always had this general impression, which quite frankly was so much fun, that you'd go out and meet with big companies, and particularly towards the end, and got to be a big deal, and then got the joy of flying home to Sydney and dealing with, I always said Cal the barber. I mean, it was kind of this interesting dichotomy that was kind of fun. I do remember one time there was sort of a realization over time that we'd really gotten to the big time. And I remember one time, I think it was during the IPO, I was with Dennis Hybe and we were walking down Park Avenue in New York, and there was a maintenance guy cleaning the fountain in front of some office building, and he was wearing Cabela's waders.
Wow.
And it was just that, that realization. And even on the IPO, more people would stop us when they were asking what we're doing and say, oh yeah, I remember we stayed at the Ritz-Carlton off of Central Park, and when the doorman was there, this guy stands outside all day.
Yeah.
So I buy all my long underwear, all my gloves, all my clothes I buy from you guys. So we were not insignificant even when we went public. But by the time we got done, with $5 billion of revenue, we were, I think, somewhere around the 700th largest public company in America. I mean, it was kind of a big deal, and to be in this little town in western Nebraska, it was an accomplishment for, a tremendous amount of people that had spent their life building this company.
Yeah. Did the investors have any comment about being located in a small town?
No. Matter of fact, some of them even liked it.
Okay.
We'd have some of these, and I'm sure there'll be listeners on here from Sydney because I know you got a big listening base, but I can remember one time having a bunch of New York investors, and we had a meeting all day, and then we said, okay, our question and answer session is going to be down at the Silver Dollar. And sure enough, we went down and sat in the Silver Dollar, and about 40 people sat around us, and we answered questions. So, and they still kind of yuck up about it. But it was, nobody cared or didn't care about us being in Sydney. The only question we got is, are you going to be able to attract the talent? And that was never really a problem. We were always able to attract talent to Western Nebraska. I mean, it was a challenge, but I don't think it was that much bigger challenge had we been in Omaha.
Where would you tap in to get to that talent? What was the pitch to get talented retail people to a town of 7,000 people?
Well, we mainly look, if you were passionate about the outdoors, it was a natural fit. As a matter of fact, I always thought over the years that being in Sydney was actually an advantage rather than a disadvantage, because you attracted somebody who knew our customer. Mm-hmm. And if you were willing to move from wherever you lived to Sydney, Nebraska, you were all in. I mean, it wasn't like you were going to start and 2 months later decide you didn't like it and quit.
Yeah.
Because there's no other place to go.
Yeah.
I mean, you had to pick your family up and relocate.
Mm-hmm. We're going to take a quick break to let you know how you can help us grow this community. We view the Commonwealth as a group of people working to change the world. By listening and supporting this show, you're crucial members of the Commonwealth. To continue this work, we need help growing our community. Please invite your friends to like the Commonwealth's Facebook page. The link and directions are in our show notes. Now, back to the conversation. So after you guys went public on the stock exchange, how did that change the company at all?
Well, it did change the company over time. There was no question. You start to have a lot, and it probably changes it in two ways. You start to have a lot of input from your board that's probably not as close to the company, and you get a lot of pressure from third-party investors that are way more interested in short-term results. So, we said we were going to resist it, and we probably did for a while. But over time, the pressure sort of mounts for shorter-term results, and there was no question it changed the culture.
Yeah,
and I think it clearly changed the culture. But I also tell you that it increased the accountability, and I think it made us a better company. And I don't think we could have got to be the company we were without going public. And I'm sure that some of my colleagues at Cabela's would debate that comment I just made.
Yeah.
But it was a interesting catch-22. I kind of view it as an important step on the journey.
Okay. How much did it accelerate growth? Like, what were you able to do?
I don't know that it really accelerated growth all that much because, I mean, we did get $100 million inflow into the company, but that was the only time the company really sold stock. So it wasn't even necessarily to raise capital. It probably did help you attract talent because things like employee stock options you can now give to employees.
Okay.
You saw a liquid way to dispose of your investment if you're an employee. And there were a lot of employees at the time that made a lot of money, who'd been with the company a long time and benefited from it.
Yeah. You already kind of touched on this, but how would you approach weighing the quarterly performance to the long-term strategy?
You just the best thing you got to do is to be able to communicate it. I mean, if you're going to make a short-term decision for long-term benefit, you need to make sure your shareholders are aware of what you're doing and why.
Okay. And after you guys went public, you started having to do quarterly earnings calls. What was that seemed like a big change, was it?
Well, yeah, it was a big change because probably the biggest change was just sharing with everybody how the company had been doing. And that because, we had no reason, we were pretty tight-lipped about the financial performance. So putting out there for everybody to look at and then have the quarterly meetings or the quarterly reports was a change. Of all the things, I don't think that was the most consequential change we had. I mean, we spent a lot of time preparing for it.
Yeah. I sat in on two of them.
Yeah, I think we did one once you sat in one once when we opened the store next to Lambeau Field with the Green Bay Packers.
Green Bay Packers. That's one I fell asleep in.
Okay.
And then Nantucket.
Oh,
yeah.
Did we do an earnings call? That was just an investor meeting.
Yeah, it was just an investor meeting, but similar sort of.
Yeah.
Did it change the way you guys built new stores?
Well, I don't know that it changed how we did it, but it clearly changed the calendar. Because if you told investors you were going to do 6 stores, you needed to do 6 stores. So it changed the pressure to open them at a particular time. Whereas in the past, we'd just have stores in the pipeline and we'd open them whenever it was the best deal for us. Sometimes we'd negotiate. I guess the way to say it is it probably limited our negotiating power to some extent because before we'd just keep beating people up till we got the deal we did. Well, now we had a real pressure to get them open by a certain date. Mm-hmm. So that would be the only way I would say that it changed it.
Okay. And how did the team decide what merchandise to sell to the store?
Well, there was a team of merchants that was their job, and it was mainly and you had them. They were organized by, I guess, outdoor categories. So you would have somebody in charge of fly fishing, and that person's responsibility was to know everything there was about fly fishing and be as honed into the customer as you could. And those people were really talented and really knew the customer.
Okay,
a lot of whom you would know. I mean, the guys that head that area, guys like Roger Verhulst, Brian Lindeman, Pat Snyder.
Yeah.
At various times, Mike Callahan, Jeff Johnson, at various times of the organization, those guys are really good at picking product and, quite frankly, really made Cabela's what it was.
Yeah. So the next topic, I realize now I should have probably wrote physically down what exactly I was going to say, but your tenure with Cabela's correlates pretty precisely to the rise in mass shootings and the public's awareness and advocacy of gun rights. What was the company's perspective on that?
Well, I'm not sure this is entirely responsive to your question, but our opinion on that was, we needed to be. I'll give you 2 aspects. So we need to be a defender of the Second Amendment, largely because we felt like our customer wanted us to.
Okay.
So that was sort of the first one, and the second one is the policy is for what we carried. And we debated this a lot and finally ended up at the place was if it was legal, we'd carry it.
Okay.
And we had products that were not legal in certain states that were legal in others, and we would carry them in states they were legal. But our policy with respect to distributing guns was to sell what was legal.
Okay.
And if somebody would call and say, we don't like the fact that you sell AR-15s, I mean, there's a process in our society to deal with those issues, and you should go talk to your elected officials who are the people that are responsible for making those decisions.
Okay. And when President Obama was elected in 2008, he was a major advocate for this movement. How did that change
Well, it didn't. It practically didn't change at all, other than gun sales at that time then just exploded. Between 2008 and about 2014, over that 6-year period, gun sales just exploded, and then dipped starting kind of in 15, maybe even through 19. They seem to be coming back now, which we can talk about. But gun sales had been tough then for. I mean, in the industry, it's called the Trump slump.
Okay. Because
I'm sorry. With the presumption is that with a Republican in the White House and a Republican controlling the Senate, there's no risk of infringement of Second Amendment rights. So there's no reason to go out and buy a gun.
Okay. If you own one already.
Or if you want more or whatever your cause is. But we had people stocking up ammunition. Those aren't and once. And it actually started a little bit before Trump got elected, but towards the tail end of the Obama administration, we started to see a slowdown in gun sales.
Okay. There's been a recent trend of gun retailers pulling out of that product category. From like Dick's is a big one. Walmart stopped doing it. What's your perspective on that?
Well, I quite frankly think it's an investment opportunity because there's still going to be huge demand for those products. And it's, unlike the rest of society, what we're sort of seeing is a push back to, the shop local mom and pop retailer is now becoming the go-to place for gun sales. I'm actually involved with a company out in Cincinnati that has a chain of about 22 locations that are both shooting ranges and sell firearms and ammunition. And their business is really going well, largely because they're seeing more people get out of the business. But I don't know how Shields is doing, but I presume they're a beneficiary of a lot of those guys getting out of the business, along with Shoot Point Blank, Sportsman's Warehouse, and some of those other types of firms.
Yeah. So in 2017, Cabela's was sold to Bass Pro. Can you walk us through that from your?
Well, I'm not sure there's a whole lot to say, but we talked a little bit about the Trump slump, which started to depress the Cabela stock price. The Cabela stock price, by the way, we didn't, and we should talk about this a little bit, we didn't talk about much about the financial crisis in 2008 because that has its own implications. But the stock price went from the IPO of 20 in 2004. It fell to about $5 in 2008 and then got as high as 70 in the 2015-16 timeframe. And then fell to the mid-30s during the Trump slump, immediately before we had an activist investor get involved in the stock who pushed us to sell the company, which caused us to look at alternatives. And Bass Pro offered to acquire the company first was $65 a share, which seemed like an attractive price for our shareholders, and our shareholders voted to accept that offer.
Okay. What's an activist investor?
Well, an activist investor is somebody who basically gets in, I guess they're active, they get involved in the stock and somehow question how management is running the company. And the thesis there was that Cabela's would be better off for their shareholders if it was sold to somebody. And that also involved, for example, we owned all of our own real estate, which a lot of investors don't. And that was my decision, by the way. Well, not entirely, but I was an advocate for that. But activist investors don't necessarily think, they think you should lease everything and deploy that capital elsewhere. There were some things like that they took issue with how we ran the business and wanted us to change it. But ultimately, their view was that the company was better off sold than as a public company. Okay.
So it was reported that activist investor bought a 9% stake?
That's directly, it might have been 11, but yeah.
11,
it's directionally correct, yes.
Yes, yeah. How does an investor with 9 to 11% ownership make?
Well, the short answer is they have friends.
Okay.
So just because they own 11, there's people that follow them that come in and want you to do the same thing. And it was pretty interesting because we had a lot of shareholder comments on both sides. But at the end of the day, when we went down to count votes, we weren't sure that even with Dick and Jim's share, that we had a majority of the share. But I remember vividly, it was a great call, a guy from Seattle calling me that said, whatever you do, don't sell the company. And his perspective, which was interesting, was if you sell the company and I get paid, my problem is I have to reinvest those proceeds in another company I like as well as Cabela's, and I can't think of one. So I mean, it was not without controversy, even among non-emotional shareholders that thought about what we should or shouldn't do.
Yeah. What was the first contact with Bass Pro? Like, were they in it from the get-go, or?
Oh, they were. There was no question they were in the process. They were very interested from as soon as the process started. Bass Pro was very interested, and I'm sure this will be an answer to one of your questions later. But I mean, what happened just because of the nature of that company, they could quite frankly afford to pay the most.
Okay.
And where that there's several ways that manifests itself, but the biggest two was if you turned our marketing arm for credit cards on at all the Bass Pro stores. And Bass Pro is very, very good at manufacturing and selling boats. So then you opened up all the Cabela's locations to be able to sell Bass Pro boats and all the Bass Pro locations to sell credit cards. It's just a very powerful combination. And quite frankly, no other bidder had those advantages.
Mm-hmm. Were there other bidders?
There were other bidders, yes.
Okay. I don't even know.
I'll direct you to the proxy we filed at the time.
Okay, fair enough. There was significant news coverage around this at that time. And like some of it was critical or shedding, I guess, a negative. They took a negative angle with the story.
Was that a question?
Yeah, no. What do you think?
Well, I'm not sure. I'm not sure I know what aspect you were talking about. There was a lot of negative impact to the impact of Sydney. Mm-hmm. And quite frankly, we were advised by our attorneys that. I mean, it's very, very clear in corporate law that's not a factor you can consider.
Okay. Which factor?
Well, quite frankly, you can't consider any factor other than what's the benefit of your shareholders.
Okay.
So what happens to the community and everything else is not a factor that can be considered by the board or the management.
Okay. And obviously you think like that was on top of your mind of the you can only.
Well, yeah, I mean, you don't have a choice.
Yeah. Okay. What was the reaction when you announced it? Like both your reaction and internally, and.
Well, the reaction among the employees, you can imagine, was negative. Mm-hmm. There was certainly on the Cabela side, there was a big we-they attitude, and I think combining with Bass Pro was clearly viewed negatively because employees understood that their jobs were at risk, and then there was just big cultural issues.
Okay.
So.
And was it was there a feeling that so at that point you worked for the company 17 years, and a lot of the people had worked there longer, and Bass Pro was the competitor through the whole thing. What was it? What was the feeling of like getting bought out by them? Was there like this is our baby type of thing?
Oh, there's no question. I think as I talk to former employees, and particularly some of those leaders who had been there longer than me, some of those people that built the company up until I got there, mm-hmm. It's been difficult to separate themselves emotionally from the brand. I mean, these are people that worked unbelievably hard to build a great company and a great brand, and I think those people have struggled with separating themselves from the brand. And quite frankly, I've had trouble. And I think being in Omaha has probably helped me. If I still lived in Sydney and drove by that mostly empty corporate office every day, it'd be more of a struggle. We were just out there at a party at Mary Cabela's a couple weeks ago, and it'd be challenging, if you were there in Sydney to see that and see what's happened to the brand.
Yeah, and just for like context, there were 7,000 people in Sydney. How many Cabela's employees were there?
At peak, we employed about 2,000 people in Sydney.
Of the 7,000?
Yeah, and I think now there's probably. Well, I think there's the 2,000 included both the retail and the distribution center, and I would guess now there's probably. I think the distribution center's closed. There's probably 400 or 500 if you include the employees in the retail store. I think there's about 300 in corporate, then probably 100 in the retail store.
Yeah. You, like I said in the intro, you were the only executive to remain with the combined company. What was that transition like?
Well, it was just, I mean, it was interesting. There were a bunch of reasons I wanted to stay.
What were some of them?
Well, quite frankly, I'm only 56 years old and I, need something to do.
Yeah.
And plus I thought it'd be helpful with the brand, some other things. So we relocated to Springfield. We worked on the integration with the company.
Springfield, Missouri.
Springfield,
which is
Missouri.
where Bass is headquartered.
Yeah, but it was very clear they just thought about things differently than we did. And there were some big cultural things that were, quite frankly, hard to overcome.
Okay.
So,
like, do you care to share an example?
Well, yeah, I can. I mean, some of the biggest ones, well, first of all, they were not a public company. So a lot of the discipline around a public company, they quite frankly weren't interested in and didn't have to have it. Mm-hmm. They thought way more about fishing than hunting. Didn't think about club. There were just differences that made their. I mean, as my brother-in-law told me, there's, if you think there's only one way to run a company and make a bunch of money, you're wrong. And they had a different way of running their company than we did. And after a while, I think we decided they were better off doing it the way they wanted to do it, which is their prerogative. They own the company.
Mm-hmm. And how long were you with Bass Pro?
About 9. From the day we closed the deal, I was there about 9 months.
9 months, okay. And at what point did you decide to leave?
It was
depart or whatever?
Yeah, it was in June we closed the deal in September of 2017. It was in June of 2018.
Okay. No, and why?
Well, we just had a difference of opinion in how the company was going to move forward.
Okay. So what are you up to now?
Interesting. I've got an office out in West Omaha. I invest in companies that are primarily in the outdoor space, do some consulting on the side. I refer to myself as Rush Creek Advisors, which is our duck hunting place up by Lisco. Still want to be involved in the outdoor space. I still really love thinking about allocating capital and trying to help businesses grow, and I've been having fun doing that.
Okay.
So,
what type of other outdoor companies have you been involved with?
Well, the two that I'm probably most involved with, as I talked to you earlier about, Shoot Point Blank is the name of the chain of shooting ranges in Cincinnati, Ohio I'm with. And I try to go out there about 3 days a month and probably spend another, 7 or 8 days a month working on that. And then there's a small company invested in Springfield, Missouri called, among other brands, it's Kid Casters. Matter of fact, I think one of your guests was Anthony Tolliver. He and I are partners in that business.
Anthony Tolliver is an NBA player, has his own episode. Thanks again for the connect on that. So,
You're welcome. Anthony, if you're listening to this, thank you. No. And then another project, which is not in the outdoor space, we formed an investor partnership in Grand Island to build, it's called Frankfurt Square Partners, which if anybody's listening from Columbus, they'll recognize Frankfurt Square as the town square in Columbus. 3 of us native Columbus people raised $5 million to build a new medical office building next to the new hospital in Grand Island. So that's been interesting. Been a lot of reasons to go out to Grand Island and see what's going on there. So those have been, I'm trying to think if there's others, but those have been 3 of the projects. I'm involved in the Bank of Bennington here in Omaha. There's a software company that spun out of that I spent a little time on. Just a variety of projects like that I find really interesting. Actually, and I wish I had this. I'm gonna mess up this quote, but my friend DJ Ihusen, who runs Chief Construction or Chief Industries out of Grand Island, talks about making people's lives better through capitalism. Mm-hmm. And I'm not sure that's a story we tell very well, but trying to help employees and trying to help entrepreneurs with raising capital and build their business is something I just find really interesting.
Yeah. How do you think that manifests itself? How is the world better through capitalism?
Oh, I think, capitalism is all about solving problems for both your customers, well, mainly for your customers, but also for your employees. And I don't think we give credit to how we're helping either of those constituencies. And I think as you look back, particularly at the Cabela's experience, if you look at the millions of customers that we help satisfy their need by providing with hunting and fishing projects or products, and the thousands of employees that we gave experiences to that they wouldn't have otherwise had, a lot of whom are people from Western Nebraska who may never have been exposed to those experiences. And I'll give you 2 quick stories that kind of manifest itself in that. I'm always a little nervous when I run into a former Cabela's employee because I'm not 100% sure what the reaction is going to be. Mm-hmm. 95% of the time it's positive, but I was with my wife and we were walking up the strip in Vegas, And 2 employees just stopped me. We happened to be there. And they just said, thank you. I could have never gotten the job had now, one of whom was a single mom from Potter, Nebraska that had moved to Salt Lake to work for somebody else. She just said, I would have never been able to get that job had I not had the Cabela's job and learned everything I did at the Cabela's job. And I think we underestimate the value we create to our training. The other one, I won't mention her name, but and this was really touching to me, but it was a friend of yours who was talking about all the exposure we gave to the kids of Sydney about what sort of career opportunities was out there for them. She said, look, if it wasn't for Cabela's, I would have grown up doing this, that, or the other thing, which would not have been nearly as fulfilling in my life what I'm doing now, because I knew through the exposure, the employees I met at Cabela's, that it was a big world out there with a lot of opportunities. Yeah. And quite frankly, it was flattering. I don't think the business community does a really good job of talking about how we're changing people's lives in a positive way.
Yeah. I have the same perspective, for the record, because I grew up so close to Cabela's, I was aware how big the world is, like far bigger than Cheyenne County. Because we traveled a bunch. I was sat in those investor meetings and the whole 9 yards. So.
No, and I think that would even be true for some of your friends growing up whose parents didn't work at Cabela's. They just happened to be in the community, but had their friends' parents, or they just saw what was going on. And man, it's a big world out there, and it's a lot of opportunities for people. And I think not only at Cabela's and not only in Sydney, but I think you expose your employees and your customers to a lot of interaction and look, make the world a better place. Mm-hmm. So,
all right. Well, thanks for sitting down with me.
Well, good. I hope this was helpful.
Yeah. Well, I'm excited to release it. And I'm also ready for the pizza and beer we're about to.
That'll be good. All right. See you, Nick.
Yeah. Thanks. And that is it for today's episode. Thanks for being a member of the Commonwealth. If you enjoyed this conversation, please tell your friends about us and leave a review. If you're interested in helping us grow this community, please invite your friends to like our Facebook page. The link and directions are in our show notes. We release episodes every Monday, so stay tuned for next week.